Muslims. But at that point in time, the tension was between these two groups. So they were all courting the favor of the king and trying to, act in their own interests. So politics was very Hindu inflected at that point in time. How the state was arranged, how statecraft was practiced, that was largely based on Hindu principles. So even in the Malayan kingdoms, right, Malacca and all that during that time, they have titles for political officers which are derived from the Hindu epics for themselves. So Laksamana, for example, from Lakshmana from the Ramayana, is one of those political officers that's in Malacca at that point in time. So they practice these sorts of aspects as statecraft and official religion. And of course, this meant that they built temples and they brought over ritual experts from India. So there are lots of Brahmin priests who were brought over to undertake rituals. So in this picture, you see the King of Siam, King of Thailand, right? And till today, their monarchy, their investiture of kingship, right? Their Pattabhishekam, or this kind of inculcating the office onto the king, it still follows, despite them becoming Buddhists, right? And Buddhism being their state religion, still follows Hindu rules, procedures, and prescriptions, right? The throne, the symbols of royalty, like the umbrella, for example, right? These are derived from Hindu principles as well, and these continue till today. So not only was this about politics, but it was also about prestige, since it was related to the elite at this point in time in Southeast Asia, right? So the kings and the princes and the merchants and the rich people, and obviously they competed with themselves amongst each other to conduct more elaborate rituals, more build grander temples. So Hinduism was a prestigious religion at this point in time, precisely because of its association with politics and with the elites, right? So power was, in this case, trafficked in Hindu terms, right? Where power arrived from, how the king could use this power, the king's power, how it was thought about, the rituals that infuse you with power. All of this were Hindu inflected for a very long time, right? And so in many ways, it becoming this sort of elite state political religion was what was responsible for many people in this region subscribing to Hinduism as well. They saw their leaders being part of this faith, and so it became understandably, they also decided to follow these sort of principles and became Hindus in that sense, right? And you can see a lot of this in terms of cultural influences, right? As it became adopted by ordinary people, Hinduism was not just about rituals or theologies and all that, but a lot of culture came along with it, right? So if you look at the slide here, you can see how a lot of Southeast Asian languages, the script, the words, right? The languages, the scripts, the literatures, all of this borrow tremendously from Hindu or Indian languages, right? So even if you look at the writing itself, it's very similar to how Tamil or Sinhala or Malayalam or Javanese looks a lot like the Bengali, right? A lot of it looks like that, right? So languages, scripts, and literatures became influenced by Hindu script, the writing itself, right? And the words themselves. Not only that, the sort of great epics such as Ramayana and Mahabharata continued to exert influence, exerted a huge influence. They were introduced into rituals, they became part of art, drama, architecture, and you can see how these texts continue to hold a tremendous attraction for people of this region. So still they have shadow puppets or theatrical or dances that are based on these great epics, and specifically the Ramayana. The Ramayana is very, very popular in the Southeast Asian region, right? And obviously it's not the same as the Ramayana that is even in India, there's many versions of Ramayana, right? As many versions as there are people who relate this tale, right? And similarly in Southeast Asia as well, it's adapted itself to local conditions, has assumed new characters, and it's a vibrant tradition in and of itself. Not only that, but theologies. We talked about politics, how ethics and rituals and all of that are derived from Hinduism. Even the calendar itself, right? It's based on the Hindu calendar. So in the Hindu calendar, for example, New Year is in April, right? And you'll find that a lot of Southeast Asian countries, such as Thailand, have New Year around the same time, around the April time, right? So the calendars were adopted from Hindu, and belief systems, what sort of gods, how the cosmology of it, what is in this world, a lot of temple buildings, instructions, temples. So in a lot of temples are modeled on Mount Kailash, Meru itself, right? And how, it is adapted to the local conditions here. So belief systems, a lot of these rituals, as I've said, the coronation rituals of Thailand continue to be part of this. And even if you think about, despite all these changes, like Malay weddings, for example, how the bride and the groom sit on a dais, that comes from a pre-Islamic tradition, right? Where the bride and the groom are supposed to be king and queen for the day and decorated as such, right? So that also has some Hindu roots in that. So a lot of these rituals borrowed. So Hinduism brought a lot of cultural influences to these regions, some of which continue to draw a lot of adherence even today, right? So obviously, much of this you can see in artistic traditions, be it drama, dance, drawings, art. So, for example, the Ramayana inspires a lot of artistic output, right? Just like in Rome, where Catholicism, produced the Renaissance produced so much of art, which is to do with religious ideals. So in Southeast Asia as well, Hinduism produced a lot of artistic traditions, a lot of stories, a lot of script, a lot of dance, art, architecture. So a lot of temples are based on these as well. Architecture, temples. You can see like Prambanan in Java, Borobudur, which is more of a Buddhist temple, also in Java. You can see ruins of temples in Vietnam, in the Cham area. You can see how Angkor Wat also. All of these were influenced by architectural principles and temples from India. So if you look at Prambanan, for example, you can see a lot of influences from the Pallava style of architecture as well, from Tanjavur, and around those regions. But there's a little bit of dispute as to who influenced who. Perhaps Indonesia and Prambanan in Indonesia influenced these Dravidian, some of these Dravidian architecture as well. So there's still a little bit of it, but the trafficking in culture is very, very apparent at this point, right? And even in terms of forms of social organization, so rudimentary aspects of the caste system, not as developed or not as highly kind of hierarchized such as in India, but principles of that, political officers, as I've said, relationships between husband and wife, a lot of these forms of social organization were also drew from cultural influences brought about by Hinduism as such, right? But so I spoke that from the 1st century, right, of the Common Era, that's when Hinduism started to percolate into Southeast Asia. But by the 13th century, there was a huge decline in terms of adherence, in terms of power, in terms of prestige, right? So in terms of island Southeast Asia, mainly Malaysia, Indonesia, and Malaysia as well, right? So, by the time the Portuguese came into Malacca, most of these formerly Hindu princes and kings had converted to Islam. So Islam became a much bigger draw during that time. So again, Islam, some would argue, I mean, there are speculations, but a lot of Islam was brought to this region also via India, also via merchants, right? From Gujarat, from South India, many of these parts of the world, right? Parts of India. So the growth of in Islam meant that the kings and queens and princes who had fostered Hinduism, who had paid for rituals, built temples, they stopped doing so. So there was a sort of waning influence. The ordinary people also saw a change in what was powerful and what was prestigious, and following their rulers as well, they too converted to Islam. So there's a conversion of rulers to Islam. So, if formerly you would hear of a princess, right? For example, the original founder 700 years ago of Singapore was Sangnila Utama, who was a Hindu prince, right? Parameswara, who founded Malacca, was also a Hindu prince. But by this time, right, by the 13th century, Hindu princes were very difficult to spot. They were converting to Islam, right? So Hinduized kingdoms were being replaced by Muslim sultanates. And that continues to be the case today. In island Southeast Asia, Islam continues to be the prevailing force and the biggest kind of religious influence and cultural influence at the moment. Along with Islam in island Southeast Asia, at the same time in the 13th century, Buddhism began to be adopted by many of these mainland Southeast Asian countries, from Myanmar to Vietnam to Thailand, Cambodia. So a lot of these, the influence or the stress, the emphasis shifted from Hinduism onto Buddhism. So Theravada Buddhism became the overwhelming influence in mainland Southeast Asia. And so the kings became, and Buddhism became the state religion. It was fostered. So it's similar to Islam in island Southeast Asia. This adoption of newer or alternate religions meant that Hinduism lost a lot of its power, lost a lot of its prestige, right? So if you go to Burma or Myanmar, or if you go to Myanmar or Vietnam or Cambodia or any of these Southeast Asian regions, you can still see influences of Hinduism, right? So these four pictures are Mariamman temples in Ho Chi Minh City, in Myanmar, in Thailand, and in Medan in Sumatra as well. So these architecture, right, art, all of this are some of the remnants of a bygone sort of era, right? And these are much more contemporary kind of aspects that you can see from the ruins of temples and everything, right? So while the religion has retreated in terms largely of power and prestige, but specifically also of the number of people, right? So there are not that many indigenous Southeast Asian adherents to Hinduism, right? So the community isn't there, right? But cultural influences continue to be. So it's like culture without community, right? So there are remaining practices, worship practices, calendrical, ritual, festival, cultural remnants of architecture, art, stories, all of that. That is like, but the community itself that supports this, right, is no longer there. There's not a sort of demography, or there's not a number or population of Hindus who are native to Southeast Asia that that sustain these sorts of remnants. So you have an absence or the diminishing of the community. The community itself is no longer there. Whatever Hindus remain in these regions tend to be those who came along with colonial powers, the diasporic Hindus who are Tamils or Chettiars, for example. A lot of these temples were built by Chettiars as well, right? So what you have, as I said, is culture without community or a big enough community in that sense. So this is the picture for much of Southeast Asia and the ancient sort of waves of Hinduism. Now I would like to move to Malaya and Singapore specifically. But before I go to the colonial era, I'd just like to let you know about some ongoing research at this point in time. Because of archaeological evidence, they found, this is the Singapore stone, stood at the mouth of the Singapore River, and the British blasted these stones apart in order to widen the entrance to the river, right? So we've lost much of these stones. We've got fragments, a few fragments, and the language is Kawi, which is sort of Javanese, Javanese sort of language, and it's difficult to decipher this, right? So this, the words and all of that have not been deciphered much, right? But recently, maybe about 2 years ago, right, archaeologist from Australia has argued that this writing, right, he discovered a word in there which refers to a Chola king. So he's making this argument, but we cannot sort of assert it forcefully because we don't have sufficient evidence. But the speculation itself is interesting, that already in the 7th century, Singapore, or at that point it wasn't Singapore, it was Temasek, was a small trading coast, part of the Hindu Sri Vijaya Empire, right? And so now we in Singapore, we used to start our history from 1819, right? So we've only had 200 years or so of history. But as you saw with the centenary commemorations, we've pushed back that history now to at least 700 years, right? So with the coming of Sang Nila Utama, a prince from Palembang in Indonesia, in Sumatra, who came over to Singapore, and he's the one who spotted a lion in this region. And so the name Temasek was changed into Singapura, which is the Sanskrit for lion city, right? So the name of Singapore itself has Hindu origins, given by a Hindu prince in Sanskrit. Meaning is from Hindu sources, right? But the interesting, exciting aspect of this new research is that now we can push Singapore's history even further, not just stopping at 700 years, but even 1,000 years, right? So from the Singapore stone, and if we decipher it more, we'd find out more that from the 10th century onwards, there has been Tamil Chola influence in Singapore. Actually, Singapore may be at least 1,000 years old. And so this is, as I said, we don't have enough evidence. So this is still speculation, but it's exciting to think about what is coming forth as we look at much more at our pre-colonial history and what sort of influences are there in Singapore, right? But I'd like to shift to the second part of my talk. So we've talked about the ancient influences of Hinduism, where Hinduism came from. The second major wave, the second major force, how Hinduism came to be in this region is through the colonial administrations, right? The colonial powers, right? So this is how the diaspora in Malaysia and Singapore was formed. And at this point, I'd like to concentrate much more on Malaysia and specifically on Singapore to talk about Hinduism in Singapore, right? So from early 19th century onwards, so from 1819, actually, as far as we can date, British colonial authorities had come over, had wrested control, had bought Singapore from the Johor Sultanate, and right. So it's not just the British who came over, right? So they brought along. They already had the empire in India, right? So they brought along administrators from there, right? Administrators, soldiers, merchants and traders came. Laborers came here as well, right? So this was the point where the community itself, a Hindu community, began to be formed in India. And this community was not an indigenous one, as was the case with ancient Hinduism and wider Southeast Asia, but one that was derived from India itself. So it's a diasporic community, right? So the establishment and growth of the Indian community in Singapore is another source for trying to understand the significance of Hinduism in this region, right? In the beginning, a lot of these people who came over with the British never had the intention of staying here, right? So obviously, in those early years, they were sojourners, right? So they came over worked for a bit. Once their term ended, they would go back, right? And they didn't settle. But gradually, the population, the Indian community started to settle down. A lot more people stayed here, right? The gender ratio became much more equal. So in the beginning, it was only men who would come over to work, right? Now women came along as well, and they settled here and they formed families, and they thought of Singapore and Malaya as their home rather than always harking back to the motherland, right? So this was the growth of the Indian community, and this was the impetus for further sort of reflections on Hinduism in this region, right? And so from the mid 20th century, you can see the Indian community starting to be formed. And at the heart of this Indian community were Hindu adherents. So I don't want to sort of flatten this and say it's only Hindus who came along and Indians are all Hindus or whatever, right? Obviously, there were Muslims, there were Christians as well. But the majority of the Indian community who settled here were Hindus as well. So from the mid 20th century onwards, there's a mass settlement of Indians who came not only to work, but also to live and to grow and to thrive in this region. So according to the 2010 census, Hindus, form 59.88% of the Indian community. And this is the latest is 2016, that's the figures 59.88. And of the Hindu community in this thing, 54% are Tamils. So Tamils form the largest part of the community, Indian community, and they form the largest part of Hinduism in this region. And so a lot of my subsequent talk from now will focus much more on Hinduism as practiced by Tamils. And this is not to say that there are no other ways of doing practicing Hinduism. Obviously, there are varieties of Hinduism, but my research expertise happens to be on Tamil Hindus, and therefore this is what I feel most qualified to be able to talk about, right? And coincidentally, they also form the majority of Hindus here, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about this colonial derived history of Hinduism in Singapore. So this plaque, as you see on the is not a very good picture, but it's interesting. It's from the Vadabatra Kaliamman temple, which is along Serangoon Road, past the Perumal temple, right? And they speculate, it's an estimate, they really don't know exactly, that this temple was established in 1830. So already by that time, the temple was being established. And if you notice on the second line from 1943, right? Some of the first gods and statues that were being inaugurated, right? And being celebrated were Periyachi, Muniswaran, and Mariamman. That's been cut off, but that's Mariamman as well. And so the sorts of gods that are coming over and becoming established, you can see, right, already in that, what sorts of gods, what sort of rituals, what sort of forms of worship are coming there, right? So the Hindu culture in this region from these times, from the colonial times, right, it's a very vibrant one, right? So obviously this is very understandable for us. You are in an alien environment, you don't know many people, uncertain about your jobs, about the environment, about your prospects, about whether you will succeed or not. It's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And of course, establishing these temples, worshipping these gods that they are already worshipped in their own homelands, right? Back in India as well. They were already familiar with them, right? Bringing these gods over was a source of comfort for a lot of these people in an alien land, right? It was something that was familiar, it offered protection, it offered comfort, and it also offered a community. People who come to the temple were part of your community. Even if you didn't know anybody else, if you didn't have kin folk here, you had the people who came to the temple. So the Hindu temple or the Hindu shrine and Hinduism at this point in time was a source of protection, comfort, and community as well. The other thing to note as well from this history is that Hinduism, unlike in sort of the ancient times and in Southeast Asia in general, the Hinduism that was introduced at this point in time with the diaspora was not an elite one. It was not a king and queen and kingdoms and merchants and elite sort of people. The first few temples in Singapore were established, and the gods such as Periyachi, Muniswaran, and all of this, they were introduced by laborers, right? So these laborers were the first ones to, worship these temples. So they brought their village gods. So most of the people who migrated here in terms of labor from Tamil Nadu came from the villages, right? So they brought their gods with them. So one of the ways in which you settle in a country and as you migrate is to bring your gods with you and settle your gods there, right? Where your gods are, you are also there. So they brought their village gods, the gods that had always been used to, right? A lot of these temples, we call them temples now, but they were makeshift shrines with atap or iron sheet kind of roofs, like rudimentary wooden posts, right? So they were sort of makeshift shrines, not temples as we know, the grand structures that we know today. They were makeshift, right? Even the priests, they were not professional priests. They were not even Brahmin priests, right? As in village temples, these were local priests who knew basic rituals, rudimentary rituals, but they were not trained in it, or they didn't know Sanskrit, or they didn't know any of these Sanskritic rituals at all, right? So they and moreover, these priests were also part-time ones, right? So they would work, and then when it came time to do religious rituals, they would come over and do these rituals. So again and again, what you see is also a lot. The rituals were a lot less complex, a lot less steps to them. They were much simpler, they were much more open, right? They were much more improvised rituals that they had already known back home, right? And this was what they brought here, and this is how they worshipped for a very, very long time. These were the beginnings of a diasporic Hinduism in Singapore. So I want to emphasize that Hinduism in Singapore was from the grassroots, was derived from the grassroots, was derived from ordinary people, right? It's a sort of a bottom-up type of Hinduism, right? Obviously, on these foundations, these temples were later built upon into grand structures by merchants and community contributions and all of that. So if you look at a lot of the temple histories in Singapore, this is how they tend to start, right? As makeshift shrines that are later built into grand structures by merchants and community contributions. Even this is a picture of the old Srinivasa Perumal temple, right? So this was the Narasimha Perumal temple, and which was then later built into the Perumal temple as we know it today. So if you look at the temples that were built at that time in the post-colonial, in the colonial times, right? The first temple to have ever been built, and this, as far as we know, is the Sri Mariamman temple, right? And this was built by Narayana Pillai. And Narayana Pillai came over with Stamford Raffles, and he was a clerk in Stamford Raffles's employment, right? And he started doing business here and gained some wealth and all that, and contributed towards his community. So the roots of the Mariamman temple, and in 1823, Narayana Pillai purchased land from the British, right? And the first temple that was there was a wooden thatched hut, right? So none of the great gopurams and pillars and all that we know today. First one was a wooden thatched hut. It's only in 1863 that the present structure as we know was built, right? And a lot of merchants and communities and contributed to this as well. If you look at Virama Kaliamman temple, that was in 1855. That was the first sort of when it was built, right? It used to be known as the Sunnambu Kambam Kovil, right? Sunnambu Kambam means limestone, so the lime. It was in a region where there are a lot of lime pits, right? Lime kilns, and a lot of the workers who worked in these lime kilns and factories, they got together to have a makeshift structure, and the first statues were made of clay, and the first priest was a part-time priest, right? It's only once they managed to gather more adherents and gather together the finances that in 1881 that they built a permanent structure of itself, right? The Srinivasa Perumal temple was built in 1855, and this was largely through the Rajagopuram itself was built. The tall, imposing tower was built with a contribution of $300,000 by Govindasamy Pillai, which at that time, as you know, is a lot of money. And another very, very early temple is also the Dandayadabani temple, the Murugan temple as well. But as you can see, again and again, village gods such as Mariamman, Kaliamman, become a hugely important aspect of Hinduism in this region as well. Right? So, if you look at a lot of the iconography today, you will see that in Singapore, this continues to be the case. Village gods continue to be celebrated. And this is not something that is unique to Singapore. I mean, this occurs in Malaysia as well, and this is occurring in India as well. If you see in Chennai, the capital city of Tamil Nadu, there are also shrines to village gods and goddesses. So Mariamman, Periyachi Amman, Kali Amman, these mother goddesses become greatly important features of many of the temples in Singapore. In fact, you will find the most number of temples is to these sorts of if you take in a larger, wider sense, Amman temples, right? Mother goddess temples. That these are the ones that are predominant here, right? There are also temples to guardian deities, right? So like Muniswaran, right? Muniswaran is becoming much more of a mainstream deity with having his own big temples. But he is also a major feature of a lot of worship in Singapore and Malaya and in Malaysia. And you will see guardian deities from the village, such as Madurai Veeran, sharing the same space or sharing the same temple. They will have their own shrines in Mother Goddesses temples, for example. Ayyanar, Veeranar, Karuppar. These gods are given space in Amman temples here, right? They act as the goddesses' guardians even here, right? And they're part of this. So these are some pictures of Veeranar and Ammans, right? And so these mother goddesses and guardian deities come along with their adherents, their worshippers, right? When their worshippers migrated to Singapore, these goddesses and guardian deities came along with them, right? So a feature of many of these gods and Hinduism in this region is these sort of rural village kind of gods becoming celebrated, becoming part of mainstream Hinduism in Singapore, right? So as a result of migration and also urbanization, right? So a lot of these gods used to be goddesses and gods used to be rural ones, right? And so now they are brought to bear in a city, and they occupy an urban space. So migration, just as Hindus migrated and became urbanized, so did a lot of their gods and goddesses, right? They also migrated over here. They are also part of the diaspora, and they are also much more urbanized than they used to be, right? And so along with I'm describing some of the features of Hinduism in Singapore, and how some of the gods that we have, the temples that we have, and some of the festivals that we have are also quite celebrated, quite spectacular, and quite unique, not in their form, but in their sort of extravaganza, in the spectacle and the emphasis placed on them. And so one of the most famous festivals in Singapore, which is like a central part of the Hindu ritual calendar in Singapore, but it is not that it's not known in India, but it's not as celebrated and not as spectacular and not as central to Hinduism, to the Hinduism that is practiced in Tamil Nadu, right? Timadi has become a central aspect of our practices of Hinduism here. So I'd like to share a video of this festival, which is from the 1913. So you can see already 1913. It's over 100 years since Timadi has become a feature of Hinduism in Singapore, right? So Timadi has been around at least that long. So this is a video that's been taken in 1913. So let me just hold on. So I'll just pause here, but you can get the general sense. Fire walking in Singapore is a very, very old, over 100 years old, and it continues to be. And many of these steps, I mean, of course, goat is no longer sacrificed, but along many of the same sort of procedures, same are followed today. So, the picture, as you can see, is a contemporary version of this, right? And so Timidi has become a central node in our festival ritual calendar in terms of Hinduism in Singapore. The other, sorry, hold on. The other obviously very prominent aspect of the ritual calendar in Singapore is Thaipusam, right? And so you can see in the picture this, I mean, we're not sure whether it's Singapore or Malaya, but again, this is a very old festival, very established sort of festival. It has its own ritual expectations. It has its own route, 3.2 kilometers, which we have evolved, and it continues to be. So the same structures seem to be followed. And again, Thaipusam is not, obviously it's derived from Tamil Nadu in India. Thaipusam is also practiced there, but not to the great regularity, the great spectacle, and the emphasis placed on it. So it's a difference in quality rather than in nature sort of itself. It's a lot more central to the calendar in Singapore and Malaysia than it is in Tamil Nadu, right? And so the biggest celebration of course in Batu Caves in Malaysia, right? So the emphasis that is placed on Timidi and Thaipusam, I'm arguing, is and the spectacle and the seriousness, this great seriousness, and with which we take it is a feature, I'm arguing, of Singaporean and Malaysian Hinduism, right? The Hindu, the festivals that we celebrate in Singapore, and I'm giving you just two examples. Their origins may be from India. Their origins may be from Tamil Nadu itself, but they have become part and parcel and a distinctive feature of Singaporean Hinduism. As I've said again and again, it's not a matter of that these things don't exist in India, right? It's a matter of emphasis rather than anything else. It's a matter of how central and how regular these festivals are. It's a matter of how elaborate and spectacular these occasions are here, as opposed to how they much more simple sort of celebrations in Tamil Nadu, right? And we've also got to take Hinduism has been around with the community and all that for almost 200 years, right? And so we've developed our own ways of celebrating Hinduism that may not hark back to an original motherland or this, but are things that we have developed to deal with the situation in Singapore. That's how we celebrate it in Singapore, right? So Deepavali in Singapore, for example, one of the key central sort of features of it is, of course, the Little India light up, right? So I'm talking about the distinctive mediums, the local mediums through which we celebrate festivals that are known in India, but the ways in which we celebrate it, the specific ways in which we celebrate it, right? The emphasis we put on it and how elaborate or spectacular we make it, right? That's something that is to do with Singapore itself, right? So I'm arguing there's a distinctive feature. There are distinctive features, and there may be something called a Singaporean Hinduism as well, right? And this draws directly back to my own research. One of my interests, and I've been working on this for about 7 years, actually, because obviously these rituals only occur once a year, so I have to go multiple times in order to chronicle them, right? Is the Periyachi Pucar. Again, Periyachi is a village goddess from Tamil Nadu. She was born around the region of Chennai itself, right? But she's a much bigger deal in Singapore and Malaysia, where there are shrines to her, where there are temples to her, there's a regular festival to her, as opposed to in India, where she's a lot more of a marginalized deity, or if she's not marginalized, she's incorporated into other goddesses' worship, so that she doesn't have a huge distinctive ritual of her own, right? And so in Singapore, however, Periyachi is a feature of the month of Adi, which is between mid-July and mid-August, right? On a Tuesday or a Friday or a Sunday, Periyachi worship is engaged in Amman temples throughout Singapore. In Tamil Nadu, for example, Adi is the time for Amman. It's for mother goddesses, right? But Adi in Singapore is specifically for Periyachi, right? She is the form of the Amman that takes on takes on the lion's share of the attention and a ritual focus during this time in Singapore, right? So if you compare between Tamil Nadu and Singapore, in India, Adi, as I said, is for general sort of Amman worship. But in Singapore, it's Periyachi who is the queen of that month, and to whom a lot of these a lot of these rituals are dedicated, right? And Periyachi in Tamil Nadu is a relatively more marginal deity, right? So she has fewer temples, she has fewer icons, there are fewer specific festivals, specific rituals, right? I'm sorry, this one is supposed to be Periyachi in Singapore, but I forgot to change it, right? Periyachi in Singapore, she has more prominent shrines, right? So this is from an Amman temple in Singapore as well. And you can see the amount of decoration, the amount of spectacle, you know, even the whole shrine itself is changed with all of this greenery into almost like a jungle kind of thing. So the amount of money, people, attention, ritual that is invested in this festival is a lot more than it is in Tamil Nadu, right? So in here, she has more prominent shrines. All Amman temples have at least one sort of Periyachi shrine dedicated specifically to her for and by herself. There's a specific Periyachi Puja during the month of Adi. They are spectacular rituals. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about these rituals, but many of you might have seen them around. And Periyachi herself, her worship is particularly associated with Singapore and Malaysia, much more than it is with the original home in India, right? And so this is just one of the examples of how Singaporean Hinduism has developed. What are the things that we have taken into heart, and what are the things that we celebrate much more than perhaps it is given attention to in her original homeland of India, right? These are some of the things that we have chosen to emphasize, and that has become part of our history, right? The other thing that we have to think about is that about Singaporean Hinduism is that it is part of, occurring in an urban city, right? So there are space constraints, right? In rural spaces, she has a lot more space. A lot of these deities have a lot more space for their temples. But here, there's a lot more constraints in terms of space. It's highly sort of supervised and disciplined and choreographed, right? And this is not unique to Singapore. When deities move to Chennai or capital cities, also this happens as well. It's a feature of urbanization. There's also time constrictions. Festivals that used to take many days or occur over many days, then they have to be shortened, right? And there's, they have to be a part of the developmental state, right? So when the state needs the space for infrastructure development or whatever, then gods themselves have to give way. Temples have been demolished, things have been shifted, all of that, right? About Hinduism in Singapore, there's a lot more rules and regulations, as the fracas over Thaipusam has shown us over the years, right? You have to get permissions. There's a lot more policing involved in this than they may have been, and this has become something that we are used to in Singaporean Hinduism, that you have to have permission, that you have rules and regulations, right? And even this may be a feature of Hinduism in Singapore, right? Another feature, I would argue, is also the multiracial and multi-religious aspect of Hinduism here, right? So specifically to do with Taoist and Chinese religion. There's a tremendous amount of affinity between Hindu worship and Taoist Chinese religion. So, as you can see in the Krishnan temple next to a Buddhist temple, and a lot of people who go to the Chinese temple also worship Krishna before they go. There's a lot of affinity in terms of theology, rituals, how we understand the gods, between Taoist Chinese religion and Hinduism as well, right? So there's a lot of intermingling in this, specifically more so perhaps in the case of Chinese adopting Hindu practices and Hindu worship rather than the other way around. But there's a lot of intermingling in that sense. So perhaps something that we can think about is how Singaporean Hinduism, it's in a multiracial, multi-religious aspect feature, and not just look at it in terms of constraints, but also look at it in terms of interracial religious participation, right? When Chinese ostensibly not, perhaps not Hindu people worship Hindu gods, or even more, carry kavadis during Taipusam, right? This is something that's interesting about Hinduism as practiced in Singapore and also Malaysia, I'm sure, right? So I'm nearing the end of the talk, actually, right? So again, I want to stress the plurality, the diversity, and the complexity of Hinduism, right? A lot of our focus, especially in terms of when we are learning or when we are studying, right, tends to be in terms of how Hinduism should be, how a Hindu should be, right? And so we tend to concentrate. A lot of research tends to concentrate on Orthodox Hinduism, where it's Sanskritic. You emphasize the theologies, you emphasize the scripture, you emphasize specialists and professionals, priests, Brahmin experts, all of that, right? You look at rituals as they're highly choreographed. You look at rituals as they are public in the temple, right? And a lot of these tend to be led by men. The priests tend to be men. Obviously, most of the worshippers tend to be men, but a lot of the choreography of this, the logistics for it, the arrangements for this, the ones who are in charge of all of this tend to be men, right? And this tends to be Orthodox Hinduism, right? But there's also practice Hinduism as it's practiced in the home, right? Where it's much more vernacular, it's much more local, it's much more popular, and there's much more emphasis on practice, right? Even something like Taipusam, for example, yes, they are sort of, it's a public event, there's a arrangement, a choreography, and all of that kind of thing, but a lot of it is about emotion, right? The closeness that you feel with God, right? And even ecstasy, when you're carrying the kavadi, the emotional aspect. Why do you want music? Because it makes you forget the pain and get immersed in, and be distracted from the pain and get immersed in your religious obligations and your religious feelings, right? So the ecstatic parts of religion is something that we tend to ignore, right? And also how ordinary people understand this, the spontaneity of this. A lot of what we talk about is highly ritualized, highly choreographed, highly hierarchicized, right? But the spontaneous thing, so when you go past a temple, even till today I do this, right? When you go past a temple, even on a bus, you just do this simple gesture of touching your cheeks and praying, right? And these little simple gestures are also what is Hinduism, right? And looking at worship as it's done in the home, in the household, this also can be very important to try to understand a lot more about this, right? And of course, when these rituals are done in the home or in the domestic households, then they tend to be much more women-led as well, right? So again and again, what I'm emphasizing is to sort of keep in mind the plurality, diversity, and complexity of Hinduism in total, right? So in conclusion, we've talked about the ebbs and flows of Hindu influence in Southeast Asia, right? And we talked about it in terms of ancient and in Southeast Asia, and most of which is gone now, except for the remnants of art, architecture, cultural sort of influences. The community is gone, the political impetus is gone, right? And then we talked about the colonial influences, which is responsible for the sort of vibrancy of Hinduism as it is in Malaysia and Singapore, right? We've talked about the multifacetedness of Hinduism, that it's got this orthodox face, temple, priests, all of that, and texts and scripture and all of that kind of thing. But it's also got this popular grassroots type of face, what you do at home, the simple gestures, the everyday things, the routine, almost things that you don't even think about, but you actually do, right? Those are aspects of it. And I've sort of tried to make a case for a uniquely Singaporean or Malaysian Hinduism, right? Hinduism has been here for nearly 200 years, right? The Indian community has been here for nearly 200 years. Surely there are some things that we have developed that are unique to us, that have been adapted to the specific cultures, circumstances, and structures that we live in, right? I also want to emphasize the grassroots roots of the Hinduism that developed here. Obviously, now it's grand and spectacular and orthodox and mainstream. We've imported priests, we've imported statues, all of that, right? But the roots of it are simple people praying for comfort and safety and community in an alien environment, right? And makeshift shrines, village gods, simple rituals, right? So I am always very interested in the grassroots aspects of it. And lastly, Hinduism has changed tremendously, right? I mean, rituals, yes, they tend to remain much more constant. But what we choose to emphasize, how we choose to pray, in what mediums we celebrate, it had to be adapted to the space, the cultures, and the peoples of the region, right? So the region, the geography, the history, and the culture of this region, of this space, Singapore and Malaysia, is particularly important if you want to try to understand the shape of Hinduism in this region. Right. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Oops.
You may have to stop sharing, or you could bring back the lead slide if you don't mind, Dr.
The
Indra.
lead one. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
One.
Hold on.
We can keep that as the backdrop to
lead slide. Which one? This one?
Your very first slide.
This one? The plan. Yeah. This one?
It doesn't seem to have moved. I can only see the conclusion
okay, hold
slide.
On, Resume share. I've stopped sharing. Hold on. Resume share.
The very first
one. Hold on.
Your opening slide.
Okay, hold on. Hold on.
Sure.
You get to see it?
We are seeing the Kavadi slides only.
Yeah, is that okay? The Kavadi slide?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay,
yeah.
I thought if you have the header slide,
or the journey, that one, the title slide. This one.
The title slide.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. No, that's not a problem. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So first of all, thank you for a fascinating, taking us through a fascinating journey, literally in a time machine, so to speak, which is quite an achievement given the vastness of the subject, the vastness of time it covered, and the small period that we gave you to present the whole thing in. So first of all, congratulations and thank you very much. Now, there are plenty of questions. So the problem is I'm peering into a small screen here, and so I might have to sort of pose these questions to you in no particular logical order. So as they come, I'm going to sort of pass on the questions to you. But one of the first questions that seems to have been asked was, how or why did Bali survive as a Hindu island in a sea of Islam? And do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
My expertise is not so much on Indonesian history, so I mean, all I can do is speculate rather than, I can't give you sort of firm kind of answers. But one of the things is that Java is the center of power of Indonesia. You know that Indonesia is made up of thousands of islands, right? But what Java does is what the rest of the population or the rest of Indonesia tends to follow, right? It's the center of everything. And Bali, by grace of its geographical position at the far end of it, right? Perhaps the influence of Islam was much slower to reach there, and Hinduism had established itself much more. The Balinese became known for that culture as well, the Hindu culture. It became part of their identity, and so they defended it much more against this sort of influence of Islam, right? And coming to the modern sort of era, it is part of the great ways in which Bali markets itself and sells itself, how it's different and all that. So the Balinese Hinduism itself became a selling point, and that, I think, that in some ways has allowed it to because they incorporated it much, and it's almost like the very fact that they are a Hindu island in a sea of Islam is something that they want to hold on to. It's what is a distinctive Balinese culture, right? And they are very keen about defending it as such.
There is a kind of a connected question, not necessarily with Bali, but I have a question saying, what were the possible reasons, if any, as to why the kings of this region chose Islam or Buddhism over Hinduism? And whether Hinduism was seen to be too complex to practice, or is there any other factors you conjecture might have been the reason for the ruling polity to move to a new practice, of faith?
Yeah. Always in terms of faith, there's also a political economic dimension to it. It's not strictly about faith itself. So by that time, the influence in court, the Muslim courtiers began to have a lot more influence, right? The trade with these sorts of regions began to expand a lot more. But I think there's also something to be said about Islam being a much less, at least from the point of view of the practitioners, a much less complicated religion. I mean, complicated not in a pejorative sense, but in the sense that what it emphasizes on equality and the 5 pillars and this sort of institutionalization and the clergy, all of that, specifically the stress on equality, right, proved to be very attractive to a lot of people there. It was much easier. There was not this great amount of rituals that you had to expend or try to understand and everything. So I think the sort of relative clarity of Islam, along with the political economic shifts that with trade, Arab merchants coming in, and that was probably responsible for the shift in that.
Would it be appropriate to sort of conjecture or speculate that while the rulers were dictated more through politics and economics combined, yeah, the people who actually in terms of those, the citizenry was, yeah, more from the viewpoint of the practice that you are mentioning. So there was, yeah, a kind of a difference between the reasoning at the ruling class versus the
yeah,
hoi polloi.
Yeah, the sort of relative clarity of Islam was probably much more attractive to people on the ground, but also, you tend to go do what your followers, your rulers do, right? There's a lot of interest in doing what, following the religion that your rulers are.
Being on the right side of
power, opportunities and all of that, your prestige that is attached to it is a lot more. So while I would agree with that, I also think that ordinary people are also affected by shifts in this political economic landscape as well.
Right. Okay, I have another question. Of course, the questioner just seems to have loved your presentation. It's an extremely insightful presentation, and I can't quarrel with him at all on that. And he's asking whether the language that was used in practicing Hinduism in the early Common Era, what did the early practitioners bring with them that would have been in Sanskrit?
Yeah.
And he goes on to say, I've heard Balinese priests still utter Sanskritic, Sanskrit-based prayers, and those must have been handed down in some form, generation to generation till today.
Yeah, probably they follow the similar sort of Gurukul kind of system, right? But not in a very strictly formal sense, but memorizing of these Sanskritic verses, typically as would priests do. And again, it's priests that tend to remember and place great emphasis on this. So yeah, probably that's how initially a lot of kings brought them over and all, they observe these rituals, and of course locals would also want to be part of this ritual economy and ritual practices. So they would learn from these or they would learn from these imported priests and preserve it for later on, right? Yeah, so that would be the case. But they also have their own sort of, for example, Kawi or Jawi, for example, which were sort of borrowed a lot of words from Sanskrit and perhaps even some from Tamil as well, right? Mm-hmm. So because that was also part of the sphere of influence, especially with the Cholas, right? So that it's part of it as well. Yes, I'm sure that's how they managed.
I have a connected question, and this is what came up in my mind. See, I mean, the influences are not necessarily from South India alone, which was from the Cholas, but also from Orissa and probably also from the eastern parts of India, because they shared a common border with Burma, modern day Burma, right?
Yes.
Now, my question is that was there then a confluence of these different styles? Because the North Indian and the South Indian styles are to some extent slightly different, right? And do we see that in any practices? Have you, is there some sort of evidence you can sort of, share with us that reveals that confluence?
Well, I mean, a lot of the Orissa and Bengali influence would go towards Burma because it's closer, right? And obviously Indonesia and Malaysia would have further down along the coast, right? So a lot of these merchants came from these sort of coastal regions and who are responsible for spreading religion, be it Islam or Hinduism, came from these regions. So, it's quite clear that perhaps Burmese versions were influenced much more by their proximity to Orissa and Bengal, while Malaysia, Singapore, and further Indonesia would be a lot more influenced by the regions closer.
In present day Orissa, even today, they have this concept called Bali Yatra, right?
Yeah.
Where they set out on, or they kind of pretend to set out on ships which are set sail towards Bali from Orissa, and it's a festival that continues now for probably several centuries.
Yeah, there's a lot of research to be done on our pre-colonial influences. We have only started to do that, so there's many questions that we have that haven't been answered because it's still being done, all of this research.
There are a couple of questions which I think will be easier to tackle. One is asking whether firewalking and Thaipusam still very much practiced in Tamil Nadu. And another question which falls in that category is, what are then the key festivals in India, Tamil Nadu, is being asked. So I know it's going to be a long list, but maybe you could sort of in a concise way.
Thaipusam continues to be there. There are Thaipusam celebrations and Thimadi celebrations in India. But as I said, it's not the festivals themselves that are radically different, right? But it's the way in which they have become central to the Singapore version of Hinduism and the Malaysian version of Hinduism, right? It's much more important to our practice of Hinduism, to our ritual calendar than it is it's one of the many festivals that Tamil Nadu has, right? It's not given a central prominence to the extent that it is in here. So it's the sort of degree rather and the sort of specificity of the mediums with which we celebrate it much, and the spectacular nature of it a lot more. It's much more simpler. There's this sort of agal kavadis, these huge spikes, this towering kind of thing. It's very rarely, in all my fieldwork, I've never really seen them there. It's the simple, one shoulder wooden post that I've seen being carried, right?
That's true.
This sort of spikes and this, and in Sri Lanka you can see that, right? You can see it in Sri Lanka, but not so much in Tamil Nadu.
Yeah. To be honest, I mean, I came to Singapore 30 years ago, and I grew up in Tamil Nadu, at least some portion of my life, and I'd never seen, other than a kavadi, I'd never seen this spiked versions of Thaipusam celebration. So to me, it was a revelation seeing it here and in Malaysia.
So we've elaborated upon to a tremendous extent on the original models. So we've left those models behind, and we've so worked on them and added and expanded. So it's become its own specific special kind of thing in here. That's what
I like your use of the phrase Singaporean Hinduism, Malaysian Hinduism, which is it's a nice way of, and I think it reflects the true plurality of Hinduism, because it is as you rightly mentioned, a multifaceted religion, and there is no one single way in which one is exhorted to practice it. While the basic principles remain constant, its practice is left to certain degree of evolution, which is the beauty of the faith. I would imagine. There is a question here which says, you said there is a lot of affinity between Taoism and Hinduism in Singapore. Why is this so? And can you give any specific example?
It's because Taoism is also plural like Hinduism. It's much more open to influences from other aspects, right? So for example, Taoism, like you can incorporate the Buddha into Taoism, right? You can incorporate, and he's become part of Taoism. So the basic fundamental is fundamental principles are similar. The multiple gods, for example, the relative openness to and easy adoption of foreign influences from other faiths, from other sort of religions, right? And similarly, it's plural and open much more than any sort of, there's no singular, this is how you should do it and all that kind of thing. And I think the sort of, to me, the polytheistic nature of both of them is what allows them to blend with each other and borrow from each other a lot more. Specific examples would be in Taoist temples, some Taoist temples, you can see a statue of Ganesha there. Right. Kuan Yin is equated to like our mother goddesses kind of thing, goddess of mercy kind of thing. So there are a lot of, not exactly the same, but there are a lot of relationships, or they can understand Hinduism using their own sort of principles because it's very similar kind of, and we can understand the practice of Taoism in many ways, the similarity of the gods, the plurality of it, the multifacetedness of it, the polytheistic nature of it, right, and the openness of it. There's no stricture on who can worship and who can enter the temple and who can't enter the temple. There's no strict, book or institution or clergy that governs a lot of this. It's a lot more about practical, pragmatic, and evolving, spontaneously evolving from the ground.
Yeah, so well put. And in fact, my own experience has been that even Shintoism, which is the sort of home religion in Japan, the ancient religion, continues to have those same features. And I've seen the Ganesha and Saraswati, who is revered as Benzaiten in the temples, in Shinto temples, right? And so Ganesha especially has this tremendous universality. In fact, he's even worshipped among the Roma gypsies in Europe, right? The entire for the Roma Ganesha is.
In some ways, I think Ganesha is a much more attractive ambassador for
universal God,
as opposed to several others. A lot of people, I mean, like Sun Wukong, for example, right? It's similar. You can understand Sun Wukong if you think about Hanuman and the similar kind of things that they do. And basis of it is also animist sort of principles, like the reverence for the earth, the trees, the environment, and these making gods and goddesses out of these elements as well. I think that also contributes to this.
I loved your phrase, culture without community, though it seemed a bit sad when you what is culture without community? But then I would slightly debate this, because in my travels to Vietnam and to Thailand, etc., while I found that those shrines had a vast number of people coming in who are actually indigenous locals, meaning Thais who are probably practicing Buddhists, or so too even in Vietnam. Maybe some of the Vietnamese, religion had been driven out of their lives by communism. But they are as passionate as any so-called, traditional Hindu. So I'm just maybe it's not culture without community. There is still a community, but we don't see them as traditional community yet.
Maybe I can sort of revise that and say Hindu culture without a Hindu community, because these people are not Hindus. They would not identify themselves as Hindus, right? They tend to be Buddhists, they tend to be locals, they tend to be this. But I mean, again, the Buddhism that is practiced there is quite open and capacious as well, that it can very easily incorporate going to a Mariamman temple and doing rituals there as well. So what I meant by that is the Hindu community identifying itself as Hindu and having their primary adherence to be Hindu is not there, right? While if you took a diasporic Hinduism, the Hinduism that is practiced continues to be linked tremendously and be sort of moored towards a community that identifies itself as Hindu.
Yeah, I had this amazing experience which I thought I'll share with you and the listeners, that when I used to be traveling to Vietnam extensively in late 90s, so I went to the Mariamman temple there, and I found that there was a Vietnamese looking priest, doing the archana, etc. And then and I noticed that he used to put on a tape there, he wouldn't be telling the shlokas or mantras. And so I got chatting with him, and then he introduced himself as his name as Ramaswamy, so
Yeah.
And he was Vietnamese by all external appearances. And
Yeah.
then it
Yeah.
turns out that his father was a Chettiar and his mother was a
Yes.
Vietnamese lady.
Yes.
And he was a very proud Hindu. In
Yeah.
fact, he requested me to bring what do you call dhupam and all that from Singapore during my trip.
Yeah.
So and he had a lot of people coming in, and I'm talking when the Americans had yet to recognize Vietnam.
Yeah.
So there was hardly any traffic there, other
Yeah.
than just indigenous population, no Indians.
Yeah. So I mean, the sort of I mean, this is a very interesting aspect. So the diaspora and how they incorporate or shaped and adapt Hinduism to fit that the situations in which they live in. I think it's a very tremendous, it's a rich area for a lot more research, which needs to be done.
Fascinating, truly fascinating. I'm going to just look up a couple of more questions. I know we have slightly run over time, but this is such a tremendous topic, and at least it excites me a lot. So it looks like, let me just look at the question. Oh yes, there's one more question. This one again goes back and talks about, in Islam and Buddhism, there have been religious envoys who came from far with the origins of the respective religions to spread these religions as their mission or service to their faith. Are there such respected figures who came to Southeast Asia as envoys of Hinduism, and where are they acknowledged? That's a very good question.
Well, I think that we have to remember that unlike Islam, Hinduism is not a proselytizing faith. And one of the reasons why it's not a proselytizing faith is because of its sort of intermingling with caste, right? So can you convert into Hinduism? Probably now you can. I mean, there are ways in which to do it, but at that proselytizing and gathering adherents wasn't a priority. A lot of Hinduism in this region was adopted willingly by people, by sort of mimicking what was occurring around them, mimicking their fellow people, or also their rulers as well, right? So it's a sort of much more voluntary aspect of it than otherwise, right? I'm not sure. So far I've not encountered any sort of envoys that came in, especially in the ancient sort of era, and perhaps this is lost to the records. They may have been, but they've lost to the records. But you could think about I guess Brahmin priests. I mean, even then they see their job as doing rituals rather than sort of persuading people to join here or explaining things to them. So I mean, I don't have any information.
I have a point to make here. Probably in Hindu faith, it was one of those things that prevented such envoys from crossing ocean.
Obviously,
that was considered to be inauspicious.
Yes.
And those so-called priests and those were not allowed to travel. Especially crossing the ocean was considered to be not preferred activity, and thus they all stayed. I mean, like if you see the likes of Adi Shankara or Madhvacharya or Ramanujacharya, they established their mutts and their the establishment to preserve the faith and preserve its original form, the literature form. Using these establishments, and that is probably one of the reasons that I think.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's one of the reasons why we, as you pointed out, is because crossing the ocean meant you lose caste, right? And you lost their sort of legitimacy as a Hindu kind of thing. They call it crossing the Kalapani, right? The black waters, and probably that explained why a lot of them explained. So yeah, thank you for.
Having said that, from my readings, I have read that Agastya Muni, sage Agastya, is supposed to have there are records apparently of him having traveled to Bali, and in fact in the Prambanan temple itself there is a alcove for Agastya Mahamuni, and also I forget the name of the Balinese temple where he is said to have actually established it, etc. So I suppose there is one evidence somewhere in history of at least one Mahamuni having traveled to beyond
But
India
it could
shows.
be also like, you know, if you think about journeys to the West, right, where people from China went to India to get the Buddhist scriptures. It could have been that way, right, that they learned much more about Hinduism. People traveling from Indonesia or Malaysia or any of these places to go there to learn and come back, rather than envoys from India coming over as well, right? So that could be part of the networks of faith. So I mean, I haven't heard. I mean, I haven't read about this Agastya kind of thing. We simply do not have enough sort of archaeological or scriptural or epigraphical evidence to say for sure.
A couple of more questions very quickly. This one, I'm just going to read it out. You mentioned briefly about Southeast Asian architecture possibly influencing Dravidian architecture.
Yeah.
How far back is this speculated to have happened? I thought that ancient Hindu states of Southeast Asia borrowed architecture from ancient India.
Yeah, this is something that historians and archaeologists are grappling with at this moment, because we tend to see this Hindu influence, this cultural influence coming from the sort of India to Southeast Asia. But we are much less aware of, or we have paid much less attention to influence from Southeast Asia itself to and Hinduism in this region to India itself, right? So the return part of that cultural exchange, right? And this has the effect of sort of overemphasizing that a lot of Hindu culture here was borrowed or derived from India, while giving much less credit to Southeast Asian improvisations, Southeast Asian spontaneous developments, and their own ideas about it, right? So again, I didn't go deeply into that because it's still in the speculative kind of stage, right? There are a lot of temples in Tamil Nadu, for example, where you know, we assume this is where, you know, the sort of Pallava architecture is all that is where Prambanan is built. But Prambanan, in many parts of Prambanan were built in the 9th century. Right. In fact, earlier, and a lot of these Pallava architecture is 11th century kind of thing, right? So historians like Sanjay Subramaniam, for example, is a famous example, right? And this is where I heard it first, right? That historians are trying to rethink many of the assumptions about the sort of traveling of influences, like just looking from India to Southeast Asia, and whether, you know, and much less attention. And now it has to be paid as how much Southeast Asia influenced Tamil Nadu and India in general as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it across very eloquently. And for many of us who have traveled to Siem Reap and seen Angkor Wat, you can see that the style is quite unlike anything that you see anywhere in India. So it's very much local creativity and local, you know, resources that influence.
Because we don't want to propose a sort of a Hindu or Indic colonization kind of thesis, right? We want to give as much credit to indigenous improvisations and spontaneity and creativity as much as possible.
Dr. Indra, there is a question by a gentleman from YouTube. It seems to be a Thai gentleman. His name is Kun Bud Chinakon Watana Palachaikun. And he says, thank you for the presentation. It has been insightful. Is Amman considered a village goddess then?
Originally, she was a village goddess. But I guess now she's no longer restricted to the village. She's become an urban goddess. Mother goddess worship started in the villages, because she was about weather, it's about fertility, it's about disease control, all of that, right? So a lot of Amman worship has its roots in the villages, but it's been a long time since it's traveled to the cities like Chennai. So there are many Amman temples in Chennai and so forth, and now she's even become a diasporic deity, overseas deity. She's come to Singapore, Malaya, Thailand, Burma, all of that, and she's gone to the US, she's gone to Canada, she's gone to all these other places as well. So now she's a much more global kind of deity.
And I would dare say that in this part of the world, especially Malaysia and Singapore, probably Amman temples far outnumber any other kind of temples, right? From whatever I've seen. And so she is really revered probably as a form of Shakti, finally, or Parvati in a process. She's been
but these sort where, you know, a lot of indigenous deities either got married to a form of Shiva, or were sort of related to wider pan-Indian type of deities in some ways, relationally, ritually, or whatever, to sort of propose. And she comes from Pudukkottai, and Pudukkottai specifically, a lot of her stories are specific Veeramma, right? And then she's linked to Kali as a wider pan-Indian kind of thing, right? Pan-Indian and even global later on.
Beautiful. Take one last call for questions, and whoever has got a burning question to ask your...
I mean, like with the Southeast Asian way of doing things, probably.
Well, again, the problem with that thesis is that as an anthropologist, there's no empirical evidence for it. There's a lot of cultural constructions of it. There's a lot of literary aspect of it. But in terms of archaeology or historical evidence, there's much less of it. But I would say an even simpler thing is that a lot of Southeast Asians and Tamils are very good at seafaring. They're good sailors, right? So you did, the distance between that, the sort of navigational skills that it took was probably well within their capacities. So through sea travel and all that, it might have spread as well.
Thank you. Very insightful.
Thank you.
I think with that we will come to the close of the session. It is my pleasant duty to thank you, Dr. Indra. I mean, this has been a most insightful presentation. We are so happy and glad to have you, and I'm sure everyone in this call, in the Zoom session, thanks you. I can see a number of thanks on
Thank
chat.
You very much for coming and listening to me. Thank you.
It's fascinating. I'm sure when your book comes out, I'm sure there are going to be at least what I can see, 28 potential buyers here who will...
But the book is not about this. So it's about politics in Tamil Nadu. So.
I was referring to the one on animal sacrifice.
That one is
other one. That's the one that's quite fascinating.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And I'm now going to, before the closing prayers, I just have two announcements to make. So permit me to share a screen, my screen. Okay. For those of you who are not yet signed up to this WhatsApp at Hindu Center broadcast group, this is a broadcast group which you can sign up to by just sending a message to this number 87680532. You just have to say join, and please do add your name, otherwise it becomes just an anonymous number. And if you have already joined and you think there are friends or relations or others who you think will benefit from joining, please pass this particular number on to them. Don't worry, this number that you send will not be seen by anyone else because it's not a WhatsApp group. It's a broadcast group. That means it's only a one-way traffic. And the Hindu Center takes great care in not sending out spam. We don't send messages out every day. No good morning messages, no and no exhorting messages. So you will just get once in a while, whenever there's an event like this, a talk or some other interesting bhakti event or seva event, you will get a message. So this is something for you to consider. My next slide is about the Hindu Center is a totally volunteer-based organization. We are a not-for-profit. We don't have any other sources of income other than whatever people give out of love and out of concern for doing something for the community. So if any of you would consider donating at whatever level that you think you can, it will be most welcome and most helpful. You can see the QR code to the right. If you can take a photograph of the slide and at your leisure make a donation. As we said, any amount is welcome, and it will support the Hindu Center in continuing with these kinds of activities. As I said, we run purely on donations, and there is no other source of income. And finally, I will close up with the closing prayers. Please join me in the closing prayers. Please mute yourselves in case you are unmuted. Om Sarvesham Swastirbhavatu Sarvesham Shantirbhavatu Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayah Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschit Dukkha Bhag Bhave Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Indra. Thanks to all of you. Look forward to seeing you at our next session.